Great. So this is the second time that I've done this presentation, but the first time was about 45 minutes long. So I'm trying to scrunch it and get us in here. But this is where we're headed today. Some of the things that I will try for us to at least touch on briefly. But I would love to, just as a touchstone for me, you don't have to do all of this in the intro, but if you could put in the chat on a scale of 1 to 10, what is your familiarity with ungrading? Those of you who are academics. Are you like, 1, I have no idea how this works, but I'm really interested. 5, I've done it once, or I do it sometimes on this thing, or 10, like, I can't believe I'm not teaching this class. Great. And while you are doing that, just a little bit about me. I hold an MFA in interdisciplinary arts with a concentration in decolonized arts practice and performance creation from Goddard College. I'm also a certified intimacy director and coordinator through Intimacy Directors and Coordinators. I work mainly in South Florida in the United States, but my credits range from local regional theater and indie and student films to projects that you can find on Netflix and off Broadway. I also teach in higher education, but I came to higher education after being a teacher in middle school and high school. And while I was in the middle school and high school setting, I started training to be an intimacy director. And it was that work and learning about power dynamics that really opened my eyes to how those power dynamics play out in academic settings, including dance settings, when we often think that we're being collaborative or that we are allowing people to have agency because they're doing embodied work. And so I started in 2018 doing co-grading with middle school and high school students. They'd give themselves a grade, I'd give them a grade. Their grade ended up being the in between of those things. And the more I did it and the more I saw it in practice, the further down the slide I went until I went to full ungrading practices in 2022 when I was in a higher education setting. And as we'll talk about today, I think these work. I think these work in terms of agency and mitigating power dynamics. And I think they work in technique classes and in theory classes. And they work in a class that's 8 students, and they work in a class that's 160 students, because I've used these practices in all of these things. Cool. So I see mainly ones in the chat. So we are going to start with some theory and some history. These are the guiding questions for our session today for you to hold as you get some new information about these ungrading practices, but also the questions that guide me when I am thinking about ungrading a class and bringing these forward. Do I trust students to show up with their best intentions, to engage with their best efforts, to support each other's learning, to trust their own needs and interests, and to be able to communicate their needs and interests to you? Framing our conversation today are the 5 pillars of intimacy direction. These were created by Intimacy Directors International in 2016 as the things that they say are required to have intimacy direction. But I find that these 5 pillars are actually really useful for framing anything that we say is consent forward, is trauma informed, is something that is supposed to be empowering and allowing people to operate in their agency. That we have to be grounded in context. We have to center communication and consent. There has to be a choreographic practice, and we have to have some closure. So this is how we're going to move through these ideas today. So we'll start with the context, which is actually the interplay of power, consent, and communication. The 2 quotes on your screen are from Paulo Freire and Alfie Kohn. And this is like the foundational precepts of non-transactional education, with Alfie Kohn, who is still writing today, and you can find his writings. So that these folks have said all along, we need to treat our students like humans, and ungrading is really based in this. Any situation in which some individuals prevent others from engaging in the process of inquiry is one of violence. To alienate human beings from their own decision-making is to change them into objects. And Alfie Kohn wrote recently, it was 2006, if your teacher is sitting in judgment of what you do, it cannot help but warp your relationship with this person. You will not be working collaboratively in order to grow. You will be trying to get him or her to approve of what you're doing so you can get the goodies, in most cases, a grade, an A, a sticker. Power dynamics are anything that influence a person's behavior in relationship to another person. So how they speak, how they choose, how they behave. French and Raven wrote a paper about this in 1959. I just wrote a paper about this, and someone said to me, "Oh my gosh, why are you using this old material?" And I was like, primary sources. 1959. We're going back. It still holds today. And they named one of the forms of power as reward power. Reward power keeps us going for the cookie, keeps us going for the act of pleasing someone else because we'll get a perk as long as they are happy. In academic settings, this looks like grades, but it also might look like the pressure of a professional relationship, especially in dance, working to please your teacher so that they put you in their company, or they say a good word to their friends who are company members, right? That power of referral might be seen as a reward. And then also financial considerations have a lot of pressure for students as well. If they have merit scholarships where they have to be earning a certain grade point average, or again, they want a professional job. So reward power, I'm looking at grades, but there's also a lot of other things that are playing in the back of students' minds. This is what appears in my syllabus in all of my classes, whether it is a technique class or a theory class like dance appreciation or dance history. Grades reinforce the hierarchical power dynamic of traditional classrooms rather than encourage creativity, exploration, and risk-taking. In order to foster those qualities, grades are not the best way to represent our learning. Rather, your full-bodied attempts at classwork will demonstrate your engagement with material. Your reflection and conversations show your commitment to your own learning and that of others. Your vulnerability and creativity in movement is valued over technical perfection. Your personal growth cannot be compared to that of dancers next to you. Ungrading only works when we enter with our best intentions and with integrity to our community, our class. As a community, we learn together, so everyone's participation is needed. Accountability to ourselves and to each other is expected. Therefore, your attendance and work engagement are expected. One of the things I hear about ungrading when I teach workshops a lot on power and consent for dance teachers, and when I bring up ungrading, I often get some pushback of like, then students will do nothing. I have not found that to be the case because most dancers I know, including dance students, are more ridiculously hard on themselves than anyone else could possibly ever be. But I put this in the syllabus as a statement of accountability. I expect your best intentions, you should bring them, and you should expect everybody else to. And also, that means that your presence is required. Your presence is required for your learning and for the learning of everyone else. I'm just gonna skip that because I don't have time. The why of assessment, why do we care if students are learning what we want them to learn, should be more important than the how. But I expect part of the reason that you are interested in this topic is because you're interested in the how. Because I've heard all of these conversations all day, and I know you know the why. You want to unsettle your classroom, you want to decolonize your classroom, you want to disrupt hierarchies and binaries. So let's get into how. So this is where we switch into choreography. Choreography for me, yes, is movement, but also it is something that is repeatable, sustainable, specific, and serves a purpose. Right? Those are precepts of choreography to me. So I do think of my ungrading formulas as a form of choreography. I can repeat them across different class settings. I have found them to be sustainable now over almost 5 years, and they are pretty specific. I have very clear outlines of what I'm doing and then why. Let's talk about a technique class first. So after that big paragraph that I shared earlier, this is what shows up in my syllabus for technique classes. This course is structured as a lab in which you are both scientist and your own, no one else's, including mine, experiment. In this metaphor, I am the director of the lab, whose job it is to make sure our experiences are safe and ethical while pushing us to new discoveries. I am a co-investigator with my own experiment of my body and creative practice. When I read this to students, I immediately follow it with some things that are not in the syllabus, but I follow it by saying, we know when we do experiments, stuff fails. Failure is an expectation. Failure is not a disappointment. Failure is not a mistake. Failure is an expectation. So when we approach our learning as an experiment, we get to fail. When you see me as a lab director whose job it is to make sure our experiments are answering the questions that we want to get answered, but also that we're not like blowing shit up and hurting each other as we go, that's the job I want to have. I'm not telling you how to do. I'm not making you do. I'm creating an atmosphere where it's safe to fail, but we know what questions we want to get answered. So I use what I call a movement experiences guide, and it's like a rubric, but I don't like to call it a rubric because students can have some real stories that come up around the word rubric. So I call it a movement experiences guide. And in it, I have 10 different categories for students to choose from. And I put some of them on this slide here. Taking creative risks, trying new things, supporting peers, integrating feedback into creative work, and then some like technical skills, alignment and balance, coordination and creativity. There are 5 others, but one of those is other, where students get to define what it is. There is nothing in my ballet 2 class that says can do 3 pirouettes. But if that is a student's goal, they get to put it in there. I want them working towards what they want to be working towards. So students use this movement experiences guide at the beginning of the semester to choose 5 of these 10 goals to be the things that they want to be graded on for that semester. They write me a letter telling me their goals and why they're interested in them. Then at midterms, they write me another letter and they tell me their progress towards those goals. Every week they have an artist log where I have very specific questions for them about what has happened in class that week. You might call it a journal. We call it an artist log. And every week they fill that out with the goal being that for their second letter, they can go back and copy and paste, or if they've done a video or audio note, give me date and timestamps to go back to say, hey, this week I did this thing. And that tells me I'm moving towards my goal because. And this week I did this thing, and it tells me I'm moving towards my goal because. And in this movement experiences guide, because it is like a rubric, I kind of set it up with some number ranges. So a 1 to 3, you're rarely doing this thing. A 5 to 7, you're often doing it. An 8 to 10, you're pretty much always doing it. Right? So then they give themselves in that midterm a score from 1 to 10. They tell me why, and that becomes their midterm grade, unless I have major questions. And then we have an awkward conversation. In my history of doing this, which like I said, it's been fully since 2022, this is the same rubric. It has grown. I started with this rubric in 2018 with high school students, and it was only 6 categories at the time, the 5 that you see and other, and it has grown since then. But since I have done this, I could count on one hand the number of awkward conversations that I've had to have with students who are not using it to the best intentions. And for the most part, they are. For the most part, students are giving themselves 7s and 8s. And then I get to come in and be like, actually, I see you doing this way more. And sometimes I get to give them a bump up, which is far more fun than giving them a bump down. At that midterm time, students can also choose to change their goals. If they're like, I've achieved this one, or I find this one really frustrating, or, I thought this was a goal, but now that we're into class and we're working on this skill or we're talking about this topic, I'm actually way more interested in this. So they can keep their same 5 goals for the second half of the semester, or they can change them. And then we do the exact same thing for finals. And this becomes their grade. We're going to pause for a second from the how to just address the myths. One, I've already touched on. Everybody gets an A. They really don't. They really don't. And it's because they're hard on themselves. Everybody gets an A or B for the most part. But again, not always. Because there are expectations of that work having to get done. The teacher won't do any work. I've heard this from chairs. I've heard this from colleagues. You just don't want to do any grading, so you make the students do it. I actually do more work with this because I'm reading. I'm reading their artist logs. I'm reading their letters. I am not putting a multiple choice test into a Scantron. I am not just doing a 1-day combination test where I see if they can execute the skills and check it off. Every week, I'm checking out their artist logs, and then twice in each semester, I'm reading full letters from all of them, or watching videos, or listening to audio notes. And then I provide each student with feedback because they're writing about their goals. They're writing about their achievement towards their goals. So I'm always giving them feedback on how I see them meeting them, how they could think about reframing it. Hey, I meant to say this to you in class and I didn't. So not only am I reading, I'm giving feedback. I think ungrading is a much more useful way for students to get feedback. Getting a feedback comment is far more useful than seeing an A. But it does mean that I have to value that as well because it does take some more of my time. This is for my dance appreciation class or dance history class. So this class last year had 160 students in it. They were not dance students for the most part. It's a gen ed that students can take. They may or may not be interested in dance. They may or may not have chosen that class. I was very interested in dance appreciation, actually assessing whether they appreciated dance, not assessing whether they could memorize names, dates, genres of dance, which I had found often is what dance appreciation class sort of templates were asking for in institutions, right? Take a multiple choice test. Can you answer when was Martha Graham born and what kind of dance did she work on? Not interested. That's not appreciating dance to me. That's memorizing some trivia. So what we created, and this came from an idea from Danielle Rosevalley, who is actually a theater movement educator. She also teaches Shakespeare, super smart, wonderful human who talked about creating buckets or bundles of grades. And so this is what I did for students in that class. We had assignments all semester long, weekly responses on the content. Every 2 weeks in class, we had movement experiences because with 160 students, I would love to move them every day, but that simply was not a brilliant choice on my part to move every day. It had to be a little more manageable. So we did it every 2 weeks. They had to give feedback to their group members, and then they still wrote their goal letters to assess. At the beginning of the semester, that goal letter said, I want an A, a B. I'm fine with a C. And you know what? Some students were fine with a C. It was a gen ed class. They just had to take it to graduate. They cared nothing about dance. Okay. If you want a C, I'm happy for you to get a C. It does not hurt my feelings or make me sad. So this transparency around the work that they were expected to do was all they had to acknowledge in that letter. In this class, I want an A, so I'm going to do this number of these things. I'm fine with a C, I'm going to do these number of these things. And you can see, even in my A, perfection is not required. You do not have to do every assignment to get an A because life happens. It's just not a requirement of good work to be perfect. So that became a clear value for students as well in looking at this. I want to talk about my weekly responses. We don't have time to talk about everything, but just in terms of weekly responses, students got a choice because we want students to be fully engaged in inquiry. We want them to follow their interests and their needs. Students got a choice about how they responded to the material each week. They could make and send me 4 memes. Y'all, if you are not making memes with your class, cannot recommend it more. It's hilarious. It's a really good time. If they make memes about that content, they can send you 4 memes. They can write me an interview proposal. And this was just a proposal. So who do you want to interview about this topic? So we're looking at Indigenous dance in America in the late 1800s. Who would you interview about this? Oh, I want to interview Buffalo Bill about why he felt like it was important to actually hire Indigenous people rather than have white people learn the dances. And then they had to propose questions. They had to propose 3 to 5 questions. So they demonstrated that they knew what we were talking about in class and their curiosity around it. How could we go deeper than we went in our 100-minute class? They could do a movement analysis. We watched videos in class quite often. They could find another video that we had not watched in class. And I had a template for them to fill out about movements they were seeing, formations, costumes, lighting, things like that, where they described what they were seeing. So they had to do more work. They had to go find and watch more dance. They could create a video playlist. Again, I showed videos in class. They could propose new ideas for my video playlist. And wow, did I get some great ones. My video playlist grew and evolved over the course of their suggestions as they went deeper into these dance genres. Or they could create a creative response. Some of them made dances. Some of them painted. Some of them wrote poems. Some of them sang songs that they made up. It was a great time. I have honestly never had more fun grading than I had grading these things. Again, it took time. Now, I did not grade 160 of them every week because I love myself more than that. What I did do was separate the students into groups of 10. So I had 16 groups of 10. So every week I was grading 2 groups, and the rest of the groups were giving feedback to their group members. And that feedback, as you saw, is required in their bundles. So not only were they learning from the things they were doing, they were learning by engaging with what their classmates were doing. We had so much great stuff come out of this. It worked honestly better than I could have ever anticipated, especially with 160 students. As we're wrapping up, you don't have to take my word for it. The QR code will take you to a page on my website with things from students. And I'm not like, go look at my website and be like, wow, great job, Nicole. No, read what students are saying about this if you think that ungrading is for you, or if you're teaching a lecture class like dance appreciation or dance history, and you're like, I've never done group work before where they're giving each other feedback or doing movement experiences. There's stuff like that on there. It worked even with 160 students, and students really found the grading to be transformative, to give them ownership over their own learning, to help them trust themselves in what they were choosing to do, working towards their goals, assessing their own performance. and making connections with their group, especially if you have a large class like 160 people. It's so easy to get lost and feel like a number, a disconnected number in that group, rather than actually really making connections to at least 9 other humans while you're there. And some closure, Q&A, and some resources. Alfie Kohn, I mentioned him before. We had a quote from him. Great books. You can follow him on Twitter. Jesse Stommel, same. You can follow him on Twitter. Also wrote a book. Ungrading is a new book out by Susan Blum. It's not just me. It's not just me doing ungrading. All of these folks are doing ungrading. Jessica Ziller teaches ballet at Texas Christian and has a book coming out from Routledge early in 2025 called Humanizing Ballet Pedagogies that will include a chapter on assessment. So if you teach ballet or if you're interested in ungrading, check that out. I just had my proposal accepted by Routledge this week. So there will be a new book coming in like 2026 for you to read about that. But Alexia Bono, Andrea Marcus, Ali Duffy, and Gina Tai were all interview subjects on an article that I did that's coming out in the fall from Dance Magazine on ungrading practices in higher ed. And I'm currently working on one for Jode as well. So stay tuned for all of that stuff. I think we have 2 whole minutes for questions.
Because of the fact that we have 2 minutes, I might jump in with the question quickly.
Great.
Um, and that question would be, how do you get the institution itself to accept the practice of
That's a great
ungrading?
question. I have worked in several different institutions in South Florida, and I always have asked my chair, like, what are the rules around grading? What do I have to do? Stuff like that. And so far, no one has had a problem with me doing the grading this way. They have all said you have to put in grades at whatever date it says. Like, I still have to figure out how those things translate into an institutionally accepted grade and put it in by that date. Um, but no one has had a problem with me doing it that way. I have had to adhere to some policies that I don't always love around, like, attendance has to equal this much of the grade, which I think is ableist and not great. And I try to be transparent about those with students at the top of, like, it's the law of the situation from Mary Parker Full. Like, this is a situation in which we find ourselves. I can give you all this much grace and compassion and deal with humanity, and this is where I can't because the institution says that, and we're all in this institution, so it's what we agreed to. So always check with your chair. And part of the Dance Magazine article will also address some, how do you fight back when people are like, it's not rigorous. And Alexia Bono has a great quote in that where it's like, actually, conformity is not rigorous. Like, why are we all just doing the same thing? It's actually far more rigorous. And I love it so much. So Alexia's got that great one in there. It's actually far more rigorous for both me as a teacher and students to engage deeply in inquiry.
Well, thank you so much once again, Nicole Perry, for your presentation. I definitely
Thank
learned a
you.
lot. I'm sure everybody here has learned quite a bit.